Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. I've got a lecture here on the adaptations of deciduous angiosperms and evergreen gymnosperms. So I've entitled this one Angie versus Jim. Um, and what we're really going to be talking about is if we think about these two functional groups, deciduous angiosperms and evergreen gymnosperms, they really occupy different parts of the world. And I'll show you a map in just a second. And so we're looking at the general characteristics that differ between these two groups of plants that allows them to dominate different places. So it'll help us understand kind of the distribution of these different functional groups and the forests that they dominate. So just before we get started, just to kind of highlight the phylogenetic relationship between these two groups of plants. This is just a real coarse phylogeny and evolutionary tree of plants, starting from the oldest plants on the far left, and as you move to the right, these are the plants that have evolved more recently. So we think of them generally as being more advanced. It's not always true, but kind of generally speaking. So what you can see is the gymnosperms and angiosperms are the two furthest right groups in the plant family. So gymnosperms are a little bit older as far as their adaptations being developed than the angiosperms. It's not a great way to talk about it because there's lots of things gymnosperms do better than angiosperms. But just so you're aware, the angiosperms are kind of, we think of being as more recent kind of evolutionary development, but they are very distinct groups from a phylogenetic standpoint. So the gymnosperms and angiosperms incorporate a huge number of plants. So in gymnosperms, we're focusing just on the evergreen gymnosperms. And then for angiosperms, we're just focusing on deciduous angiosperm trees, all right? So just to look at a map of the forests that these different functional groups dominate. So on this map, I don't know if you can read the key down here in the bottom left, but there's lots of different forest cover types. What I really want you to see is that all of the colors that are more in the red family, so we've got like a brick red and orange, pink, and purples. Those are all dominated by evergreen gymnosperms. And then the blues and greens are dominated by deciduous angiosperms. So you can see in general, they're fairly distinct regions that these different functional groups dominate. Much of the western US is dominated by evergreen gymnosperms, although you can see this band, especially on the west side of the Sierras, that's dominated by deciduous angiosperms. Those are actually the oak savannas there. And then on the eastern part of the US, both functional groups occur on the eastern US, but you can see there's still fairly distinct areas that they each dominate. So the evergreen gymnosperms dominate the southeast. The deciduous angiosperms dominate much of the Appalachian Mountains, some other parts of the inland area, and in the northeast. And then you can see there's a little more mixture in these northeastern states and Wisconsin and Minnesota as far as the deciduous angiosperms and the evergreen gymnosperms kind of commingling or co-occupying the same areas. But for the most part, they're really fairly distinct areas, and that's because there's really distinct adaptations of these two groups that cause this kind of separation in where they dominate. So just a little bit of framework and thinking about these as distinct groups. So first we're going to start out by talking about some adaptations that are a little more specific to evergreen gymnosperms. And then after that, we'll talk about the deciduous angiosperms. Now, most of what I'm going to talk about is related to things we've talked about either in the Plant Phys Primer or in other parts of the class. So you'll be familiar with most of these concepts. We'll just talk about them a little more specifically as they apply to these two functional groups and how they allow these plants to dominate different areas. So I've got a lot of slides for this one. but you've got, again, you've got the background information. You've seen most of this material before, so I'll go through them fairly quickly. But what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to stop every 10 slides or so, and then have you like answer some questions on the quiz. So I'll make sure the quiz is in order of these slides, and I'll just take a break. You can go answer a couple questions, come back to the video. You can tell me if that works better than the way I've done it in the past or not, but just trying new things. Okay, so again, we're focusing on differences between evergreen gymnosperms and deciduous angiosperms. And I specify that because there are a couple of examples of deciduous gymnosperms, only a couple, and there are a decent number of examples of evergreen angiosperms. So we're not focusing on those right now, just the evergreen gymnosperms compared to deciduous angiosperms. Okay, so these are the kind of topics, concepts we're going to talk about related to evergreen gymnosperm adaptations. So we're going to talk about apical bud dominance, what are the implications of being evergreen, talk about freezing tolerance of both living and dead cells, drought tolerance, talk about needle packing and boundary layer, and then a little bit about leaf angle. So you can see you're probably familiar with some aspects of all of these topics. Okay, so before we dive in, just one more kind of big picture topic or thing, I guess, to talk about. If you look at these two climate diagrams, you can see really distinct differences, especially in precipitation. Now, the one on the left is from the Cascade Mountain Range in Washington, and the one on the right is from the kind of northern part of the Appalachians in Pennsylvania. But if you look below at the very bottom of the page at the MAT and MAP between these two sites, they're comparable. MAT in the Cascades is a little warmer, and MAP is a little higher, or it gets more precip than in the eastern Pennsylvania. Now, if you think back to the Whitaker diagram, where you've got precip and temperature on the two axes and the different biomes in there, the temperate deciduous forests were in wetter places than the evergreen gymnosperms. And so if you look at this climate data and think about that diagram, it doesn't really make sense. Why the forests, and I guess I should have tied this a little better to the map we just looked at. Remember, in the western US, those systems are dominated by evergreen gymnosperms, which corresponds to this climate diagram. So the question then is, why in a place that receives such high precip, so 1,600 millimeters, and is relatively warm, why is that dominated by evergreen gymnosperms? And place that's a little bit colder and a little bit drier is dominated by deciduous angiosperms. It's kind of the opposite of what we would think. And so we're going to kind of be talking about why evergreen gymnosperms actually dominate in the western US a little bit throughout this process, and why they don't dominate in the eastern US. And so take-home message here is really this distinct dry period in the Cascades during the summer months. So again, this is a Mediterranean climate where you have precip in the winter and dry summer. And it's that dry period that really is not conducive to growth of deciduous angiosperms, and the evergreen gymnosperms can tolerate that a lot better. So we'll kind of come back to this diagram a few times this week, and we'll bring it back next week a little bit briefly, just to talk about why evergreen gymnosperms are dominating a place that, based on just annual climate, we wouldn't expect them to dominate. Okay, so when we think about evergreen gymnosperms, really the take-home message is that they're good stress tolerators. They can tolerate different types of stress, but that's kind of their bread and butter, if you will, as far as their strengths as a plant functional group. Whereas on the other hand, deciduous angiosperms are really good at outcompeting other plants for resources, but they're not so good at tolerating stress. So what that means is, in places that we think of as being stressful, have some kind of environmental stress, that's generally where we see evergreen gymnosperms being successful. And so when we think of kind of environmental stress conditions, this is this isn't everything, but this is a pretty good list of kind of how the environment might be pretty harsh for a plant to grow. So places with lots of snow and wind can be harsh to the leaves growing on trees. Low nutrient availability certainly is going to limit plant growth. The length of the growing season, cold temperatures, drought, high light conditions, these are all environmental stresses that evergreen gymnosperms are actually good at tolerating, and most deciduous angiosperms are not. So we're going to really focus on these conditions and what are the adaptations evergreen gymnosperms have to deal with these conditions. So let's first talk about snow and wind briefly. So when we're thinking about kind of like harsh, cold environments that are really high in latitude, so really far north, or high in elevation, those places generally get a fairly large snow load, and they have lots of wind. So the snow loads can be a disadvantage to plants, because if you're talking about trees with big long limbs, when it snows, if that snow sits on the limb, that's a lot of weight for those limbs to handle. And so that's where that can be stressful. Also, the wind is not just the wind itself so much, but it's the particles or particulates that are blowing around in the wind. Those are little like projectiles that are bombarding the leaves. And so that can be a really stressful condition. And we'll talk a bit about canopy structure and how it helps deal with these kind of conditions. So actually, I guess I should say here, for needle structure and investment, I'm not going to show any other slides, but what we're really talking about is high LMA, right? So plants with high LMA have built these more robust leaves. And we've talked about it in relation to nutrients and resistance to herbivory, but it also is really resistant to these harsh environmental conditions. So when you've got lots of wind blowing around and kind of blowing these particles around, the high LMA of evergreen gymnosperms allow them to hold up against those kind of environments, whereas a plant with really low LMA, those leaves would just be torn to shreds. Okay, so that's about how the needle investment is an adaptation to these kind of conditions. When we really think about snow loads and partially to wind conditions, it's really related to canopy structure. And so if you look at a picture on the right, this is a very stereotypical evergreen gymnosperm, right? The nice conical shaped, fairly narrow canopy. And the reason the plants grow this way, kind of mechanistically within the plant, is what's called apical bud dominance. So if you look at this picture here, and see, you can kind of notice how short the branches are. They're not growing out like these big long branches. Most of the resources of this tree are going to the apical bud, which is at the top of the tree. And so evergreen gymnosperms in general have what we would call strong apical bud dominance, meaning all of the photosynthate, or the vast majority of photosynthate that all of the leaves accumulate during photosynthesis, that all gets shuttled up to, not all, the vast majority gets shuttled up to the top of the tree so it grows taller. And because not as many of those resources are allocated to the branches, they don't grow out as long. This is an advantage in these harsh conditions because these branches are not really huge, they're not really thick diameters, and they're not really long. So they don't have the same buildup of snow loads on the branches as a lot of deciduous angiosperms would have. And so that allows them to handle those high snow loads, and also can acts as less of a sail in those high wind conditions. So the canopy is not as exposed to as much wind stress. Contrast that with this picture of this deciduous angiosperm in the bottom left-hand corner. This is a bur oak, which some of you had for our lab activities. And you can see how long and thick those branches are relative to kind of just the apex, the top or middle of the tree. So those branches are gonna, if it snows a lot and that snow accumulates on the branches, it's a lot more stressful for those plants, and it's more likely that those branches are going to break and fall off. So apical bud dominance is where you have one main stem with really short branches. And in the evergreen gymnosperms, it's very common, but a little less common in pines and junipers. So these two pictures here on the bottom right are of different pine species. And you can see it has kind of that apical bud dominance where you have a fairly strong central kind of stem, but those branches are starting to get pretty long, especially this one on the right. So it's not in every family, or sorry, every genus. Yeah, family too. Not in every family of evergreen gymnosperms, but it is pretty common. Okay, I'm going to take a short break here and have you go answer a couple of questions in the quiz. And then when you answer those questions, come back and you can watch the next section. Again, not again, I didn't say this yet. On the Canvas quiz, you have unlimited time. So you can go ahead and open it and just leave it open while you're watching the video. Okay, we'll talk about low nutrient availability and short growing season now. And I've combined these two together because the adaptations of evergreen gymnosperms, they kind of, they go along with both of these, or they allow those plants to deal with both of these conditions quite well. So I'm lumping those together a little bit. And really what we're talking about when we're talking about adaptability or being adapted to low nutrient availability in short growing season is the fact that these plants are evergreen. So we're really focusing on the evergreen aspect now. And being evergreen allows these plants to be better at conserving nutrients. It allows them to have a better carbon balance during a short growing season. And that means, and when we're talking about carbon balance, we really mean, they're gaining more carbon than they're losing. And kind of along with that, it extends the growing season by being evergreen. So we'll just talk about these briefly. When we're talking about nutrient conservation, what we're really talking about is the fact that these plants invest a lot in their leaves, so they last a long period of time. So we're talking about LMA. So you all are very comfortable with LMA, and you know that plants with high LMA have leaves that stay on the tree longer, but they have slower photosynthetic rates and lower nitrogen concentrations. So here's an example of a type of plant that is adapted to grow under low conditions. And the way they do that is by having, investing a lot in their leaves so they can reuse what little nitrogen they have over and over. So the high LMA means they're adapted to work with less nitrogen, so they have lower photosynthetic rates. They also have slow uptake rates, so they're not taking the nutrients up as fast. But what they do is they reuse those bits of nitrogen they get over and over and over. And so that allows them to be really conservative and efficient in how they use nitrogen over time. So that's really related to the long tissue lifespan. The other thing we didn't really talk about is the nutrient retranslocation. And what nutrient retranslocation is the ability to move an atom of nitrogen from one place in a plant to another place in a plant. And when this is really important is when a plant is about to drop a leaf. So if it's about to drop a leaf, that leaf represents a lot of nitrogen that the plant worked hard to get. And so if it can take some of that nitrogen back before the leaf drops off the tree, it's able to reuse that nitrogen somewhere else. And it's a better strategy, especially in places where there's very little nutrients or few nutrients. So evergreen gymnosperms are really good at reusing the nitrogen over and over again. One, by having leaves that last a long time, and two, by being able to retranslocate the nitrogen to a new leaf before it drops an older leaf. And we've looked at figures, I think, similar to this before, or maybe we've looked at this one before, I can't remember. But this just shows in the kind of red or brick red color is the needle-leaved evergreen trees. And then the broadleaf deciduous trees are the orange. So today we're kind of comparing those two. And if we look at this kind of right-hand axis here, this is the leaf nitrogen content. And it's a little hard because it's this three-dimensional graph. But if we look over, the center of this brick red circle is around 21. And if we were to draw a line across here, it's probably somewhere around the 50 ballpark, 40 or 50 for the orange one. Again, the orange one is the deciduous angiosperms. The brick red one is the evergreen gymnosperms. So just showing some actual data that the evergreen gymnosperms do indeed have lower nutrient concentrations, and that lower nutrient concentrations that's associated with that high LMA. Okay. The other thing, sorry, I'm not quite in sync with my slides right now. This graph shows the needle lifespan of a bunch, 5 different evergreen gymnosperm trees. And what I like here is especially this Picea mariana, which is adapted to cold conditions. If you look, so on the y-axis of each of these are the mean annual temperature of where these samples were collected. And at the coldest places, you can see that how high the leaf lifespan is. It's around 15 years for some of these individuals. It's quite similar for Picea glauca as well. So these really cold, harsh environments that we think of evergreen gymnosperms dominating, those plants in those coldest places are really keeping their leaves for a really long time and reusing those nutrients over and over and over for 15 years before they would drop a needle. Okay, the other thing related to being evergreen that helps plants in these kind of harsh and especially cold environments is that in these colder places, we have really short growing seasons. Sometimes a month or two is what we would think of as the growing season. And evergreen gymnosperms are, as you know, they have lower nitrogen concentrations, lower photosynthetic rates. But what they can do is they can maintain those photosynthetic rates, although slower, they can maintain those over a wider range of temperatures. And that's what's just showing in this figure here. We have the deciduous angiosperms, this kind of bluish line that goes higher. And then conifer species, these are our evergreen gymnosperms. And so the maximum photosynthetic rate of the evergreen gymnosperms is indeed lower than the deciduous angiosperms. But you can see in these colder temperatures over on the left-hand side of the axis that the photosynthetic rates for the evergreen gymnosperms is actually higher than the angiosperms at cold temperatures. So they're much better at doing photosynthesis under cold temperatures. And so in places where, several months out of the year, maybe it gets, above freezing during the day, but every night's dipping into the freezing temperatures, that's actually a good strategy to have. Low photosynthetic rates, but doing it for a longer period of time. And so then the other aspect is extending the growing season by being able to keep their leaf temperature a little bit warmer than the actual air temperature. And we've talked a little bit about this with boundary layer conductance. Remember, boundary layer conductance or the boundary layer inhibits the movement of heat and water. And so it can act as like a blanket and trap heat at the surface of the leaf. I'm not gonna, in years past, I've talked about boundary layer, but we've already talked about this some. So I'm gonna skip over this. This is a summary of boundary layer though, just to refresh your memory. So boundary layer thickness impacts the flux of water and heat from a leaf. Remember, a thicker boundary layer results in slower water loss and heat loss from a leaf. The boundary layer thickness is related to wind speed. So slow wind speeds, you have a thicker boundary layer. Leaf size, remember big leaves have bigger, thicker boundary layers. Needle packing, which we're going to talk about in a second, and then leaf shape. And we won't talk about leaf shape that much. It has a smaller impact on boundary layer than those other factors. So what needle packing is how many needles are packed in a certain length of a stem, okay? So this graph here on the x-axis, you can see is needle packing, and it's the number of needles divided by a centimeter, All right, so it's how many needles there are per 1 centimeter. That's probably about a centimeter. All right, so a plant that has 2 needles per centimeter has less needle packing than a plant that has 20 needles per centimeter. Okay, so needle packing causes your needles to be more dense on the stem. That was a better way of saying it. This is important because if we go back to boundary layer thickness slide, remember that big leaves tend to have really thick boundary layers and small leaves have thin boundary layers. This is true, and if, or the only time this isn't true, I guess I should say, is if all of those small needles are really packed close together. So what happens on an evergreen gymnosperm, if it packs all of its needles together, the boundary layer no longer acts on an individual leaf, it acts on the whole branch. And a whole branch is kind of like a really big leaf, right? So what happens in plants that can pack their needles together, they end up with a really thick boundary layer. And so that's what you can see in this figure here. The two sets of lines are calm conditions where it's not very windy, and then down here you have windy conditions, and then these are just 3 different species. But what you can see for all of them is that the more needles are packed on a branch, so that's further on the right side of this axis, the thicker, or sorry, yeah, essentially the thicker the boundary layer is. The way they've estimated boundary layer is how much warmer the leaf is than air temperature. That's what's on the y-axis. Over temperature is just how warm the leaf is relative to the air. And so you can see that the leaves warm up a lot relative to the air when they pack their needles together. So if you look on the calm days here, some of these data points get up to 14 degrees Celsius warmer than air temperature when their needles are packed together. So it can have a really big impact on leaf temperature. Remember, packing those needles together results in a thicker boundary layer. And so this allows plants with tight needle packing to warm up and photosynthesize on days that would be too cold for other plants. Okay, so I've added a note here under the boundary layer thickness about leaf size. That boundary layer of, I put conifers, but really we're talking evergreen gymnosperms, doesn't act on individual needles, but on the whole branches when they're really packed together. Okay, let's talk about extremely cold temperatures, and then we'll take another break. So what we're really going to be talking about is freezing tolerance, and we're going to be talking about living cells and dead cells. So frost tolerance or freezing tolerance is something that kind of develops and goes away every year in plants. In the summer, when temperatures are not dipping below freezing, plants usually don't have very good freezing tolerance, but as temperatures start to cool down, they develop this ability to deal with those cold temperatures. And then I will also say that roots are not as tolerant as leaves. So roots will experience damage at warmer temperatures than leaves will. And I mention this just because we won't talk about it in detail now, but in lots of places that are seeing a decrease or experiencing a decrease in snowpack, those soils are getting colder in the winter because they're not insulated by the snow. And actually, we're seeing die-off of trees in some of those situations. Okay, so actually, I want you to pause here and watch this video. It's just like a 2-minute video describing freezing tolerance in trees. And I think it does a good job of explaining this. So I'm not going to pause myself. I'll count on you pausing the video. All right, so just a couple slides that are related to and kind of, I guess, show what that video was talking about in different ways. This figure here on the upper right shows the molality of sucrose on the x-axis. It's really just the concentration of sugars in water and the freezing point of that water. So we know water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius, but that's pure water. If you add sugars to the water, it's going to keep that water liquid to colder and colder temperatures. And that's what this line represents. If you pack it with sugars, that water won't freeze until maybe minus 20 degrees or lower. So that's what's going on as these plants are developing their freezing tolerance. So we have 3 stages of freezing tolerance, or kind of 3 levels of freezing tolerance in plants, and we're talking specifically about the living cells now. So I just want you to remember these kind of 3 levels. Down to minus 5 degrees Celsius, generally the mechanisms plants use to tolerate those conditions is simply to reduce some of the water in the cells. By reducing the water, that effectively increases the sugar concentration, keeping the water in the cells liquid instead of a solid. And I guess I should have said, like, well, I guess the video says it, but if water freezes, you know, that water expands as it freezes, and so then it's going to rupture the cell. So that's why plants want to keep the water liquid. Okay, sorry. Back to this, this slide. So minus 5 degrees is just reducing water content. Down to minus 25 degrees, what plants generally do to tolerate those conditions is they break down starch. So starch is a much larger molecule than sugars, and it doesn't help prevent water from freezing. So they break starch down into sugars, and then they put those sugars inside of their cells to increase the sugar concentration even more than reducing the water. So now that really allows the liquid in the water in those cells to remain liquid instead of turning to a solid. In the extreme situation that temperatures are pushing below minus 25 and all the way down to minus 50, there's actually 2 mechanisms plants can use. Some plants will use both of these mechanisms. Some plants can only use one of these mechanisms. But the 2 possible mechanisms we observe in plants is that they produce special proteins that actually bind water molecules and prevent them from forming that solid network. The other thing that some plants can do is essentially they can dehydrate themselves and put all or almost all of the water outside the cells. And then when it's outside the cells, they just let it freeze and it doesn't do damage to the cells. Then once it thaws, they're able to resorb that water back into the cells and maintain function. So it's almost like a way of dehydrating themselves completely and coming back to function when temperatures get warm again. So those are the ways that plants can tolerate these different temperatures. We're talking about these right now relative to evergreen gymnosperms, but this also applies to the buds of deciduous angiosperms, which we'll talk about in the next section. Okay, so that's living cells. When we think about dead cells, and what we're really talking about is the xylem now, we already talked about this. I talked about it in the plant phys section, the second one, where during a freezing and thaw event, what can happen is that air bubbles can form inside the water of the xylem. And if that air bubble doesn't redissolve when temperatures go above freezing, it will cause cavitation, resulting in an embolism. So remember, an embolism is when a xylem cell is filled with air instead of water. And if that happens, remember, a plant can't conduct water through that cell anymore. So if that happens to one cell, no big deal. But if it happens to lots of your cells, that plant isn't going to be able to conduct water very much. The stomates are going to have to remain closed to conserve water, and so that's going to reduce photosynthesis. Right? So for a plant growing in a place that experiences lots of freeze-thaw cycles, you would want fairly small xylem cells because those air bubbles are much easier to redissolve. So if you don't remember that, go back to the second plant phys primer video, and it explains it in a little more detail. I showed this figure in this slide. This is mean conduit diameter on the x-axis and percent loss of conductivity due to freezing. What you see is that the larger cells experience 100% loss of conductance when they're frozen, whereas plants with small diameter cells are able to maintain conductance even after a freeze-thaw cycle. Right, so we're talking about evergreen gymnosperms. Oh, I took out this slide because I was trying to make it faster. But if you remember, tracheids are the cells that evergreen gymnosperms use to conduct water. and they're smaller diameter than vessel elements, which is what deciduous angiosperms use to conduct water. So that allows them to grow in these places that experiences these freeze thaw cycles. All right. So that's the adaptations of evergreen gymnosperms to freezing in really cold temperatures. And we talked about kind of the living cells and the dead cells separately. So I will take another break and you can answer a few questions in the quiz. Okay, up to now, what we've really been talking about is evergreen gymnosperms' ability to tolerate kind of cold places. But at the beginning, we talked about how this functional group is really good at tolerating stressful conditions in general. And so another condition they're able to tolerate that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with cold temperatures is drought. So there's lots of places in the Southwest and Western US in general that are really dry that are dominated by evergreen gymnosperms as well. So we've already talked about this mechanism, but we'll just review it real quickly. And it also briefly mentioned it in the video you watched in freezing tolerance. But remember that water column in the plant is a continuous column of water. And if that water column breaks, it's going to prevent water from getting up to the leaves to keep them hydrated. And so during a drought, this means that plants that have fairly narrow xylem cells are able to resist the formation of air bubbles in those cells better than plants with really big vessels. And so what we see is we looked at this graph in the plant phys one, so I won't go into too much detail, but this value on the y-axis is P50, which represents the water potential when a plant loses 50% of its ability to conduct water. And that seems to be kind of a magic number. When plants hit that 50% loss of conductivity, they're probably on their way out and going to die. So what we see in these graphs is that at the driest places, we find the plants that are able to resist those embolisms and maintain the conductance of water. Whereas in wet places, there's no reason to grow those types of cells and to be able to resist the embolism formation. So those plants can't get down to very negative water potentials without losing their ability to conduct water. So this makes sense. Plants in dry places can maintain the conduction of water through their cells. And this is because they tend to be smaller diameter. So this mechanism allows both freezing and drought tolerance in plants. And because evergreen gymnosperms use tracheids to conduct water, remember, tracheids are smaller diameter than the vessel elements. And so this allows them to maintain function during these freeze-thaw cycles and during these really dry conditions. So this is where I think, and I like this intersection of plant physiology and distribution of species and ecosystems, is this one little cell that's dead when it's actually operational in a plant, that has a huge impact on where a plant will and will not grow. So I think that's kind of a cool linkage. Okay, just again to remind you of the difference in the cells that these different plants are using, tracheids versus vessel elements. You know all of this, but it's here if you want to look over that and refresh yourself on those aspects. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about is high light environments. So plants generally want lots of sunlight because that's what provides the energy for photosynthesis. But there's a point where the light coming in is too much for the plants to handle. And when this happens, it can actually damage the cells and all of the proteins that are being used for photosynthesis. And when this happens, it's called photoinhibition. So if plants are getting too much light, it actually reduces photosynthesis. That's where the term kind of photoinhibition comes from. So anytime you get super like clear skies, really hot conditions, those are one situation where it maybe makes sense that the plants are experiencing like really high light environment. but it also happens a lot when you combine clear skies with cold temperatures. Because if you remember, we've talked about proteins, the sensitivity of proteins to temperature. So at cold temperatures, those proteins and enzymes, they can't function very fast. So if you put them in that state where they're not functioning very quickly and you blast them with lots of light, that's a condition where they can't handle it and they start experiencing damage that causes reductions in photosynthesis. So in a lot of the places that the evergreen gymnosperms occur and dominate, the potential for photoinhibition is really strong. And so there's a couple different ways that plants can deal with these high light environments. So the first part of this slide kind of summarizes what I just said. And the second one here, these defense mechanisms, that's what we'll talk about here for just a second. So one way to deal with a high light environment is chemical defenses. So these chemical defenses can help protect the proteins and enzymes from damage so they can maintain function despite this high light environment that they're growing in. Another one is a structural defense. So some plants have different chemical components in their leaves. Well, I shouldn't use the word chemical. They are chemicals, but they provide different structures in the leaves that can reflect or absorb those high light environments. So the example I have here is that a cuticle, which is just a waxy layer that can form on the outside of leaves, that can help reflect some of the incoming light and prevent it from getting into the leaf where it would do its damage. So you've got the chemical defenses that protect the enzymes in the leaf. You've got a structural defense, that extra layer on the cell. And then you have morphological defenses. And this morphology is, the growth pattern of the plant. And what we're talking about here is leaf angle. So we did a whole lab on leaf angle showing how leaves at a steeper angle relative to the light coming in are going to warm up less than a leaf that's perpendicular to the incoming light. Do you like my hand signals here? So if a leaf that's growing in a cold environment with clear skies is growing horizontally, it's going to be absorbing the bulk of the energy coming in, that solar radiation, and more susceptible to photoinhibition and damage due to those solar loads. So what we see is plants can adjust their leaf angle in order to deal with the different conditions. And we see this especially strong in evergreen gymnosperms. So what we have here is two different species of trees, a spruce on the left and a fir on the right. So these are both trees growing at fairly high elevations. And on the y-axis, we have needle angle, and this is the degrees from horizontal. So if it's a low number or a lower number, it's growing more like this. And if it's a high number, it's growing more vertically. Then what they did in this study to see how the ability of plants to adjust their leaf angle is they measured the leaf angle of some trees growing out in the open. And then they also covered some other trees with some material that reduced the solar energy coming in. And they watched the leaf angle of new leaves growing on the trees under the shelters. And so that's these diagonally hatched lines here, or these bars. Those are the plants growing underneath the shelter where solar radiation loads were lower than the plants growing in the exposed areas. And so what you can see is when they're sheltered from solar radiation, the leaves start to grow more horizontally because they're trying to absorb as much radiation as they can. If you take that cover off, the needles are going to be growing more vertically to minimize how much solar radiation is being absorbed by the leaf. And this is really all about beam spread, right? So if you're growing more vertically, that the solar energy is being spread out over a larger surface area and less is getting into the leaf. And so that's helping prevent this photoinhibition from occurring. Okay, so I've got some text on there to help summarize those results. So that was needle angle. This figure here shows how much UV light can get into a leaf. So in this study, they actually measured the UV light that could pass through a leaf. And what you see here, they divided it into 4 different groups: the conifers, which are the evergreen gymnosperms; woody dicots, so this is really our deciduous angiosperms; grasses; and then herbaceous dicots. And what you can see is that in conifers, none of the UV radiation gets into the leaf. So due to their chemical structure, the chemical defenses and that structural component, like they're able to block that UV light getting into the leaf, whereas these other species are more susceptible to that UV light getting in and causing damage in the leaves. So these evergreen gymnosperms just have a little more ability to adapt to these high light conditions that can occur when combined, especially with cold temperatures. Okay, and then lastly, all I want to say about evergreen gymnosperms before we transition to deciduous angiosperms is that, I've always talked about these things as being these cool adaptations that plants have for dealing with these harsh environments. But remember, there's always a trade-off. And so for evergreen gymnosperms, the trade-off is that they are maintaining their leaves all year long. They're keeping those cells alive in all of those leaves, and that comes at a cost due to respiration. So remember when we talked about carbon balance, the very first thing that plants have to allocate carbon to is that baseline metabolism. And when you have your leaves, all of your leaves on all year long, you're giving carbon to those leaves even on days when it's too cold to photosynthesize. So there's a trade-off to keeping those leaves and having these really tough, robust leaves, and there's a big carbon cost associated with it, right? But in these particular environments, that seems to be worth it. It's worth making that trade-off so that they can, all of the things that comes along with those evergreen leaves. It can use nutrients more conservatively. It can grow, it can extend its growing season and grow under colder conditions. And it can deal with those harsh kind of wind storms and heavy snow loads. All of those things that go along with being evergreen in this case, they outweigh these trade-offs. But I just want you to keep in mind that there are trade-offs associated with this strategy. Okay, I'm going to pause it again. You can take answer the questions to part 3 in the quiz, and then come back and we'll focus on deciduous angiosperms. Okay, let's transition to talking about deciduous angiosperms. So this is an interesting functional group when you think about the fact that they drop their leaves for a large part of the year and have no ability to really grow during that period of time, or certainly no ability to gain new carbon. So the question then becomes, like, how can a tree that gives up on growth for a large part of the year actually outcompete a tree that always has its leaves, like an evergreen gymnosperm? And so that's we'll talk about those adaptations that allow these plants to kind of make up for lost time, if you will, since they're without leaves for so long. How do they get enough carbon during that growing season to outcompete other plants? So take-home message here is, in order to do this, to outcompete evergreen gymnosperms without your leaves for part of the year, when you do have your leaves, you need to be growing kind of at the maximum capacity of a plant. So then, let's think about the environmental conditions that are required to support really fast growth. So we've talked about lots of reasons that would prevent plants from growing their fastest. So we'll kind of flip that around. A plant needs lots of nitrogen to grow really fast, right? If you got lots of nitrogen, you can make lots of rubisco. It needs lots of water so that it can continually supply its leaves with new water and keep all of those cells hydrated so that the stomates can stay as wide open as possible. We've talked a lot about enzymes and temperature, right? That if you get too hot, the proteins are going to fall apart and denature. If it's too cold, it slows those enzymes down. So there's this optimum temperature that plants also need in order to keep those enzymes growing or kind of moving at as fast as rate as possible without them denaturing. And then, of course, light. We've talked about, when we talked about the steps of photosynthesis, light is kind of the first part of it where it's providing the energy to drive photosynthesis. So needs lots of light as well. So what I'm going to focus on is three of those things. Optimal temperatures, lots of nutrients, and lots of water. So that's what's required for these plants to grow fast during the time that they do have leaves. And here's just a summary of what I kind of just said. So now let's look at the adaptations that deciduous angiosperms possess to allow them to utilize those good conditions and grow as fast as possible. Just as a general rule, as we're thinking about this, the time that deciduous angiosperms do have their leaves, a rough ballpark of the minimum time they need to be able to have their leaves is 4 months. So if the growing season would be less than 4 months long, or they would have their leaves for less than 4 months of a year, it's probably a situation where they're not going to do very well and outcompete evergreen gymnosperms, even if the conditions were really good. So we're talking, 4 to maybe 8 months or so is the range of the growing season deciduous angiosperms need to have. And when we looked at the two figures early on in this lecture, one was from Pennsylvania and one was from the Cascade Mountains in Washington. And so here again is the one from Pennsylvania. And the difference between this one and the figure from the Cascades is that here in Pennsylvania, we've got a precip that comes all year long and definitely comes during the growing season. Whereas if you remember, the one from Washington had this dip in precip during the summer months. And so this is just kind of showing this ideal conditions in Pennsylvania where we have pretty good temperatures and good amount of precip during the time that these plants are going to have their leaves. And so that's kind of the situation we're looking for deciduous angiosperms. So I guess actually I should go back to this and just point out this a little more. These ideal temperature conditions. I kind of glossed over it, but you can see that this is average daily temperatures that are summarized to month. So you have all done this. So what that means is during the summer, the average temperature of a day is around 20 degrees. That means it's going to be warmer than that during the day when the plants are actually growing and colder than that at night. So during these kind of few months here in the middle of the growing season, we've got temperatures that are probably in the 30 degrees Celsius range during the days, which is perfect for the enzymes of photosynthesis. That's about their maximum, but still far enough away from getting too hot that they might denature. So it's a good range, and that's when they're growing during that time of year. The other thing that we see a little more in deciduous angiosperms than in evergreen gymnosperms is kind of this ability to regulate leaf temperature. And I hesitate to use the term regulate because for some species, they're not actively regulating. It has to do with the size of the leaf and the boundary layer thickness. But then other species are able to regulate their temperatures a little bit more by adjusting how fast they're transpiring water and their leaf angle. The take-home message, though, is that plants growing across a wide range of environmental conditions, their leaves are most active and they're able to keep leaf temperature between about 19 and 23 degrees Celsius. So in this figure, on the y-axis, we're just going to look at this upper panel here, A. On the y-axis, we have the temperature of the leaf when it's growing. And on the x-axis, we have mean annual temperature of that particular location. So each symbol represents a species growing in a different location. But you can see we're going all the way from the subtropics down or to the cold end of the boreal forest. And across almost that entire range, the leaves, when they're actively growing, are between 19 and 23 degrees Celsius. The exception is represented by this red line here. These are the pines. So the pines, which are the largest genus in the evergreen gymnosperm group, does not have this ability to regulate its temperature as well. It gets hotter in hot places and colder in cold places. So just showing that the deciduous angiosperms seem to do a better job of keeping their leaves at that kind of optimal temperature for growth. Okay, so optimal temperatures, deciduous angiosperms are growing in places that are optimal. So where they have temperatures that are really good for growth during the growing season, and they can maintain their leaf temperature a bit within some optimal range. So that's talking about how they're able to kind of maximize the optimal temperatures for growth. Let's talk about nutrients. We've talked about this a lot, so I won't go into this in much detail, but you know that higher nitrogen concentrations in the leaves allow plants to produce more rubisco, and therefore they can photosynthesize faster. And so we've looked at this exact same figure before, showing that positive relationship between nitrogen concentration and photosynthetic rates. I won't go into this figure because we looked at it with evergreen gymnosperms, but again, just showing the difference in nitrogen concentration between these two functional groups, and deciduous angiosperms having higher leaf nitrogen concentration than evergreen gymnosperms. So deciduous trees need lots of nitrogen. They have more nitrogen in their leaves. That means they can attain higher photosynthetic rates. We've talked about specific root length a little bit. So just to revisit that, remember that plants with this very fibrous root system, like this picture on the left, with a smaller investment of carbon, they can explore more of the soil. And that's how plants can maximize their ability to take up nitrogen, is exploring as much soil as possible. Whereas this taproot has got a lot of carbon investment, but relatively small amount of surface area of its roots. All right. My wife just walked upstairs. She loves listening to me lecture, so she's just sitting down here listening to me. That's a joke. She doesn't. Okay, what was I talking about? Specific root length. So here's just a figure showing the difference in specific root length between deciduous angiosperms and evergreen gymnosperms. So on the y-axis here, we have specific root length. Remember, high value means plants can explore lots of soil for relatively small amount of carbon investment. And then on the x-axis, we just have a lot of different species. The ones highlighted in the red box, these are the deciduous angiosperms, and you can see they, all except for one, they have much higher specific root length than the evergreen gymnosperms. So this is part of what allows them to take up nutrients so quickly during the growing season and attain those high leaf nitrogen concentrations. Because remember, like every fall, they're dropping their leaves, so those nutrients that were in the leaves, most of those nutrients are going back into the soil. So they're going to have to retake those up in the spring. And so it's really important for them to have a root system that can do that as quickly as possible. Okay, there's summary of that slide. Notice that the last little bullet point there, that blue bullet point, is that there's a trade-off. Remember, we talked about this a little bit with the specific root length, but having a high specific root length is really good for exploring lots of soil. Those roots are very thin and not very robust, and they tend to not live a long time in the soil. So the trade-off is you build these roots that are really good at taking up nutrients, but they're going to die fairly quickly. But in a system where your leaves are senescing every year, maybe you don't really care if your roots are living a long time or not. Okay, the other thing related to this, the specific root length is talking about how they get those nutrients quickly. But the other thing is, if there's not a lot of nutrients in the soil, it doesn't matter if you have a root system that can take them up quickly. You know, there's just not enough nitrogen there. So it turns out that, you know, deciduous angiosperms only grow in places where there is enough nutrients. And the fact that they have low LMA means they have low litter quality or high litter quality, and decomposition rates are faster. So it's kind of like this circular argument a little bit. But where the deciduous angiosperms grow, there's lots of nutrients. They take them up every year. They drop them every fall in their leaves, and their leaves decompose in the fall and over the course of the winter, re-releasing those nutrients. So decomposition rates are really relatively quick. And so you've got this fast turnover of nutrients, so these plants can take them up every year. Okay. Oh, I think that was the box I was looking for. Typically have faster rates of nutrient cycling in deciduous forests because of that high litter quality. Okay, I'm going to take a break here, I guess. Actually, I'm just going to plow through, and then you can pause and do the quiz. Um, so we've talked about optimal temperatures, lots of nutrients. Let's talk about water briefly. And we've already talked about this pretty well with evergreen gymnosperm, so it won't take long. So we know that the deciduous angiosperms need to grow really fast during the growing season. That means they need to keep their stomates open as wide as possible for as long as possible. So they need to be able to transport the water from the soil up to their leaves as quickly as possible to keep those plants or the leaves hydrated. So what we see, this is a graph showing the relationship across a bunch of species. These blue symbols here are angiosperms. The red ones here are gymnosperms. The green ones, I believe, are grasses or ferns. I can't remember which. But this is kind of like moving along evolutionary time. And what you see is that plants that have achieved the highest photosynthetic rates, A max on the y-axis, are also the plants that have achieved the highest conductance, or the ability to conduct water the fastest. So we've already talked about this some, but this is just a different figure kind of showing that relationship. Remembering that the conductance is strongly related to the radius of the cells that the water is moving through to the fourth power. So remember, like a small increase in the size of those pipes is a big impact on water movement up to the leaves. So for deciduous angiosperm that needs to keep those leaves hydrated, having big pipes or using big pipes to move that water through is a big advantage and kind of the most effective way to keep those leaves hydrated. But we've talked about two trade-offs associated with this. Because they use big pipes, it means they're not very freezing tolerant and they're not very drought tolerant. So both of those things limit the ability of these plants to maintain growth in kind of cold and dry conditions. I don't think I need to say anything here. These are just different images of cells. On the left side here, I'm not sure I've shown this image, but this is just some scanning electron micrographs of tracheids. And you can actually see in this one, it's kind of cool. You can see how they're closed at the end. You see how this cell here is tapering. So it's tapering, but closes at the tip. Whereas remember, vessel elements are open on each end, allowing the water to move through faster than the tracheids. Okay, so we've just talked about these achieving these fast growth rates in the optimal conditions. And I talked already about how deciduous angiosperms need about 4 months of good growing conditions in order to dominate a system. And again, here's those two graphs we talked about a couple times. The one on the left being from Washington, and this is from a place where evergreen gymnosperms dominate. The one on the right is a location in Pennsylvania where deciduous angiosperms dominate. Both have optimal temperatures. Both receive enough precipitation to support deciduous angiosperms, but it doesn't come at the right time is kind of the big issue here, is that this one in the Cascades has this dry season with the deciduous angiosperms not being able to tolerate drought. That's going to limit their ability to grow and dominate this system versus the climate diagram shown on the right. Okay. Remember though, so we talked with evergreen gymnosperms, we talked about, all of these cool adaptations they have to grow in these harsh environments, but there's this trade-off with that baseline metabolism that they have to keep supplying carbon to throughout the entire year. Deciduous angiosperms don't have that carbon requirement for all of the leaves. But there are some things going on during that dormant period that are required to keep these plants alive. And really what we're talking about is kind of the buds in a deciduous angiosperm. So I think what I'll do is I've gone on long enough. I'm going to pause it for you to do the next section of the quiz. When you come back, we'll talk a little bit about kind of this dormant season component to the biology and ecology of deciduous angiosperms. Okay, last part of the lecture. Let me put it in presentation view here. So now we're going to talk about just a few considerations of the dormant season for deciduous angiosperms. And we call it dormant season. It's a bit of a misnomer. The trees aren't completely dormant. There's still action going on inside the tree, and there's still the potential for kind of mortality of a tree during these conditions. So we'll just talk a little bit about that transition from the growing season into the winter and back out in the spring. So this is just a slide or in a figure here on the right showing some of the processes going on in the fall that trees are doing in order to get ready to senesce their leaves, because they're going to drop their leaves. And we know that deciduous angiosperms in general have a lower LMA and invest less in their leaves than evergreen gymnosperms. But they still invest in their leaves. And so they try to get some of those resources back out of the leaves before they drop them. So if we look at this figure on the right, on the x-axis we have months or time essentially from September through around November 15th is when the study stopped. And there's just two species here. So Populus tremuloides are the black triangles, and Quercus rubra or red oak are the white or open triangles. So first here you can see chlorophyll content drops drastically as the leaves are preparing for winter. And this is because we've talked a lot about nitrogen being important for rubisco. It's also really important for chlorophyll. And so what the plants are doing during this time is they're breaking chlorophyll down and taking the important pieces back out of the leaves, storing it in the woody tissue until the spring, and then they can reuse some of that nitrogen in the spring. You also see a little reduction in sugar concentration. So they're removing some of the carbon from their leaves. They're also using a lot of that carbon during the process of translocating things. So we're seeing reductions in the sugar. But I will point out that the interpretation of the sugars is a little more uncertain in why it might be decreasing or not decreasing. So that we don't put a lot of weight on the interpretation of that. But you can see, similar to chlorophyll, the nitrogen content is dropping really drastically during those summer months. Or sorry, not summer months, fall months. So much like the chlorophyll, other sources of nitrogen, particularly rubisco, they're taking the nitrogen out of those molecules and then pulling it out of the leaf and again storing it for use in the spring. So that's leaf senescence, and that's kind of the preparation of the plants before they actually drop their leaves. Now there's still a lot of nitrogen in their leaves and other resources that get put onto the forest floor and then are decomposed over the next year or two or however long it takes. But they try to get some of that stuff out so they can reuse it. Senescence in the fall is triggered by some combination of temperature and day length. Some species are more sensitive to temperature, some more day length, but it seems like for most species it's some combination of those two things that kind of indicate to the tree that they should be pulling resources out of their leaves and preparing to drop their leaves. And then the actual process of translocation, when those leaves are on the tree, of course, you know that there's xylem passing through the woody tissue into the leaves, and there's phloem for communication back and forth. During this time where they're getting ready to drop their leaves, they seal that off. They create these kind of barriers in the cell, and then that's when you start to see the leaves drop off, is when that barrier happens. And different species are able to break that connection better than others. Some species will drop all of their leaves really quickly. Some keep most of their leaves for a long period of time and slowly drop them over the winter. One thing I notice is the oaks on Elizabeth Street. I live on West Elizabeth. In the oaks on our street, a lot of them don't lose many of their leaves unless there's a super intense windstorm. And so I always wonder about that connection and how well they actually break that in the fall. So anyway, that's what's going on during leaf senescence. Once leaf senescence happens, we kind of think about those trees as being dormant, but there's a very important tissue that has to remain viable and alive during the winter months. And those are the buds. So sometime during the growing season, they produce buds that will become, new stem tissue, new leaves the following growing season. And that's where the meristem is. So we've talked about meristem and grasses being below ground or at the soil surface. The main meristem for trees is actually on their branches and twigs in these buds that they produce. And so those buds are susceptible to the really cold conditions and really dry conditions of the air during the winter. And keep in mind that these trees aren't transporting really much water during the winter. So whatever moisture is in the buds when they're formed, the tree really needs to hang on to that moisture in the buds throughout the winter without a supply of new water. So the trees will pack a lot of sugars into the cells of the buds. And we talked about the freezing tolerance of plants. We talked about it relative to evergreen gymnosperms, but the same kind of mechanisms happen in the buds of deciduous angiosperms. They essentially pack a bunch of sugars in their cells so that that water doesn't freeze or become solid. And then also the bud scales are the kind of part that encases the buds. And there's lots of interesting patterns on the bud scales. If you're interested in kind of like those minute details, look at buds this winter, get a hand lens out and go look at them. It's kind of interesting. But what you can see in this picture here is just some different buds, and I'll highlight two of them. This resinous bud here, the bud scales are sealed in like this waxy layer, and that helps prevent water from being lost from those buds, so that helps those cells stay hydrated. And then this villus bud here, this kind of fuzzy one, all of those little hairs increase the boundary layer thickness, and so that can help slow water loss by having a thick boundary layer. It slows the water loss from those buds and helps them stay hydrated as well. So there's different mechanisms to keep those buds from freezing and to keep them hydrated during the winter. But that ability of some species to really maintain the hydration of their buds and keep them from freezing is what allows them to grow in colder places than other deciduous angiosperms. So the buds in that winter time are still really important. And then bud break in the spring, I'll just say a couple things about this. When I talked about leaf senescence, I said it was driven by temperature and day length. Bud break is not the same. It's really driven by temperature. And so bud break is just when the bud scales start to open up and the new leaves start to emerge. That's bud break. And we did an analysis a number of years ago where we looked at what environmental factors trigger bud break in a bunch of different species. And we did an analysis where it could be temperature, day length, precipitation, and it could be temperature and precip at different times of year. Like we just analyzed all these potential variables, and it turned out it was just temperature. So this graph here just shows you the day of year where the environmental variable best predicts the timing of bud break. And if it's red, it's temperature, and if it's blue, it's precip. And you can see we only have one species where it's triggered more by precipitation than it is temperature. All the others are bud break is triggered by temperature, either sometime during the winter, like this top one here is a little more about the winter temperature, but most of them are that kind of springtime temperature that triggers it. So really just temperature is the major driver for bud break. This is important because as temperatures, and particularly spring temperatures, change, that's really affecting the timing of bud break. Because senescence is temperature and day length isn't changing. And so that's kind of mitigating the timing of leaf senescence in at least some species. But with temperature being the driver of bud break, we're really seeing big changes in the timing of bud break for different species. So I just have one figured here to kind of highlight the importance of bud break on kind of ecosystem function. Here on the x-axis, they have spring air temperature anomaly. So 0 is when spring is the same as it's always been. When it's a positive number, it means spring temperatures were warmer than normal, and negative numbers mean spring was colder than normal. Then on the y-axis, we have spring GEP anomaly. So GEP is gross ecosystem product. It's really, we can just think about it as carbon assimilation or carbon accumulation of the ecosystem. A positive value means the ecosystem is taking up lots of carbon. A negative number means it's actually releasing carbon in respiration. And so what you see here is that whenever spring temperatures are warmer than normal, GEP, or carbon accumulation, is greater than normal. So in this case, warm temperatures in the spring cause earlier bud break and allow plants to accumulate more carbon throughout the growing season. So in some systems and some conditions, this is a really good thing when we think, at least from the carbon budget standpoint. But there's a big caveat to this. If warm temperatures occur in the spring and trigger early bud break, and there's less soil moisture that year, you actually end up with less GEP or less carbon accumulated because the plants run out of water earlier in the year and then they're just respiring for the rest of the growing season. So it can actually be a negative thing. So spring temperatures could contribute to more carbon accumulation, but if it's combined with low soil moisture, it actually would be less carbon accumulated than normal. So just a summary of kind of this spring temperatures and bud break, that often they result in greater productivity, but it can, if you have a drought or drought conditions occur due to low soil moisture, you can end up with less carbon. And that sensitivity to spring frost also can increase. If temperatures are warmer in the spring and they trigger bud break, and then you have a frost event after that, that can do a lot of damage to plants. It can kind of take away a lot of the carbon that they had invested in those new leaves. So highly variable in how deciduous angiosperms are going to respond to these spring temperatures, but it definitely seems like these changes in spring temperatures are having an effect on the functioning and the regeneration of trees, deciduous angiosperm trees, throughout the US and throughout the world. Okay, so just to highlight one last thing, when we're thinking about deciduous angiosperms, don't forget to think about kind of the dormant season conditions and what's going on during that time. Even though we think of the plants as being dormant, there's still important kind of aspects going on in that transition from growing season to winter and then back. Okay, that's it for all the adaptations of evergreen gymnosperms and deciduous angiosperms. You can go and take the last part of your quiz, and you're done for this week.